Open almost any map of the war in Ukraine, and the conclusion seems obvious. Russian forces still control large areas of Ukrainian territory. In parts of the Donbass, they continue to make slow advances, capturing villages one after another. Every new map appears to tell the same story. Russia is still moving forward. To many people, that can only mean one thing: Russia is winning. But history warns us to be careful. Some of the greatest military disasters in history began with successful invasions. Armies marched across borders, captured cities, and occupied enormous territories, only to discover years later that they had lost the war they thought they were winning. Because wars are not won simply by capturing land. They are won by achieving the political objectives that made leaders choose war in the first place. That idea may sound simple, but it changes everything. Instead of asking how much territory Russia controls today, we should ask a much more important question. Has Russia achieved the goals it set out to accomplish when the invasion began? To answer that, we need to return to February 2022. When Russian troops crossed Ukraine's borders, this did not look like a war designed to last for years. Everything about the opening operation suggested speed. Missiles struck military targets across the country. Armored columns advanced from several directions at once. Airborne troops attempted to seize strategic airports near Kyiv. The operation appeared designed to shock Ukraine into collapse before it could organize an effective defense. The Kremlin's expectations were ambitious. Ukraine's government would fall. Kyiv would be brought under Russian control. A government friendly to Moscow would replace the existing leadership. Ukraine would abandon its path toward the west and return permanently to Russia's sphere of influence. Some Russian officials even questioned whether Ukraine should exist as an independent nation at all. In their view, Ukraine was not simply a neighboring country. It was historically part of Russia's own political and cultural world. If those assumptions had been correct, the war might have ended within days. Instead, almost everything unfolded differently. Ukraine's government remained in Kyiv. Its political institutions continued functioning. The military refused to collapse. Local authorities continued operating. Millions of ordinary Ukrainians volunteered to defend their country in ways few observers had expected. The quick political victory Russia hoped for disappeared almost immediately. That changed the entire nature of the conflict. Instead of a short campaign, Russia found itself fighting a prolonged war. And long wars are very different from short ones. They are no longer decided only by armies. They become contests between entire societies. Factories matter. Economies matter. Technology matters. International support matters. Public morale matters. And political determination becomes just as important as military strength. This is where many people misunderstand the meaning of battlefield success. Imagine two runners competing in a marathon. One runner sprints ahead during the opening miles, but becomes exhausted before reaching the finish line. The other runner advances more slowly, but continues moving toward the actual goal. Looking only at the early stages, you might think the first runner is winning. But the finish line tells a different story. Wars work in much the same way. Capturing territory has value only if it helps achieve the political objectives that justified the war. If those objectives become less achievable over time, then every additional mile captured becomes less meaningful. That is exactly why military historians distinguish between tactical victories and strategic victories. A tactical victory is winning today's battle. A strategic victory is achieving tomorrow's political outcome. The two are connected, but they are not always the same. As the months passed, Ukraine not only survived, it began changing. Its armed forces expanded rapidly. Combat experience transformed thousands of soldiers into seasoned veterans. Military units learned to adapt under constant pressure. At the same time, something even more important was happening inside Ukrainian society. Rather than weakening Ukrainian national identity, the invasion strengthened it. Before the war, language often shaped political discussions inside Ukraine. Millions of citizens spoke Russian in everyday life, while also living as Ukrainian citizens. Moscow believed these cultural ties might make Ukraine easier to influence. Instead, the invasion produced the opposite effect. More and more people began identifying first and foremost as Ukrainians. regardless of the language they spoke at home. The attempt to pull Ukraine back into Russia's orbit instead reinforced the country's independent identity. History has seen this pattern before. Foreign invasions often unite societies instead of dividing them. External pressure can strengthen national identity rather than erase it. That appears to be one of the most important consequences of this war. Yet despite these political changes, public attention often returns to the battlefield maps. Who captured another village? Who advanced another mile? Those questions matter, but they do not answer the biggest question of all. If Russia originally sought to replace Ukraine's government, it has not happened. If it hoped to eliminate Ukraine's independence, that has not happened either. If it expected Ukraine to abandon its Western ambitions, the story is becoming far more complicated than anyone expected in the opening days of the invasion. And as the war continued, the consequences reached far beyond Ukraine itself. The invasion did not only change one country, it began reshaping the security of all Europe. Old alliances grew stronger, military spending increased, new technologies transformed the battlefield, and the conflict slowly evolved into something far larger than the rapid operation Moscow had originally planned. To understand whether Russia is moving closer to victory or further away from it, we must now look beyond the battlefield and examine how the war transformed Ukraine, Europe, and the international balance of power. Because sometimes the most important victories are won far from the front lines. By the end of the first year, one thing had become impossible to ignore. The war was no longer changing only Ukraine. It was changing Europe itself. Ironically, many of the strategic consequences of the invasion were the exact opposite of what Moscow had hoped to achieve. Before the war, NATO was facing difficult questions about its future. Some European governments were reducing defense spending. Others believed the era of large-scale wars on the continent had ended. Even the alliance's future expansion had become a subject of political debate. Then Russia invaded Ukraine. Almost overnight, those debates disappeared. Countries that had remained militarily neutral for generations began reconsidering their security. Across Europe, governments announced major increases in defense spending. Factories expanded production of tanks, missiles, artillery shells, and air defense systems. Military recruitment increased, and cooperation between NATO members became stronger than it had been in years. Instead of weakening the alliance, the invasion gave it a renewed sense of purpose. From Moscow's perspective, this represented a major strategic setback. If one of Russia's goals was to push NATO farther away from its borders, the opposite happened. Europe became more united on defense, and the alliance grew stronger politically and militarily. Ukraine's relationship with Europe also changed dramatically. Before the invasion, Ukraine's integration with Western institutions was moving forward, but often slowly and with political disagreements. After the war began, that hesitation largely disappeared. Billions of dollars in financial assistance flowed into Ukraine. Western countries supplied advanced weapons, shared intelligence, trained Ukrainian soldiers, and signed long-term security agreements. The partnerships created during the war reshaped Ukraine's future in ways that few people could have imagined before 2022. Whatever happens on the battlefield, Ukraine is now far more closely connected to Europe than it was before the invasion. That may prove to be one of Russia's greatest strategic failures. But wars are never decided by diplomacy alone. They are also fought through industry. Despite unprecedented Western sanctions, Russia's economy did not collapse. Factories continued operating. Energy exports found new buyers. Trade shifted toward alternate markets. The Russian government reorganized parts of the economy around wartime production and demonstrated an ability to keep supplying its military despite heavy international pressure. For many analysts, that resilience came as a surprise. However, surviving sanctions is not the same as emerging stronger. Wartime economy brings its own challenges. As military production expands, it demands more workers, more resources, and more government spending. Labor shortages become more severe. Inflation creates pressure on ordinary households. Money that might have been invested in civilian industries, infrastructure, or technological development is increasingly directed toward the war effort. Such an economy can continue functioning for years, but it often does so by sacrificing long-term growth for short-term military needs. The battlefield tells a similar story. Russia continues producing tanks, missiles, drones, and artillery. It continues recruiting soldiers and launching offensives. Yet every advance comes at a price. Modern warfare consumes equipment and manpower at an astonishing rate. Capturing even a small village can require weeks of fighting, thousands of artillery rounds, and significant losses on both sides. The closer you look at the battlefield, the clearer one reality becomes. Territory is expensive. Every mile gained must be defended. Every destroyed vehicle must be replaced. Every experienced soldier lost represents years of training that cannot easily be recovered. This is why military planners never judge success by maps alone. They also ask a second question: was the cost worth the objective? At the same time, Ukraine was adapting faster than many experts believed possible. Unable to match Russia's larger population or industrial capacity, Ukraine focused on innovation. Drones became one of its most effective weapons. Cheap unmanned aircraft began destroying equipment worth millions of dollars. Naval drones challenged Russia's Black Sea Fleet. Electronic warfare disrupted communications. Artificial intelligence helped process battlefield information faster than ever before. Perhaps most importantly, Ukraine created an extraordinary cycle of innovation. Engineers, software developers, defense companies, and frontline soldiers worked together continuously. Lessons learned in combat were quickly transformed into new equipment and new tactics, sometimes within weeks. The battlefield became a laboratory for modern warfare. Military organizations around the world began studying these innovations, recognizing that future wars would almost certainly be shaped by the lessons being learned in Ukraine. After years of fighting, one conclusion has become increasingly clear. This war is no longer just a battle between two armies. It is a test of endurance, adaptation, and political will. Russia has demonstrated that it can sustain a long war. It continues to recruit soldiers, expand military production, and replace much of the equipment lost during the conflict. Its economy has adapted better than many early predictions suggested, and its armed forces today are more experienced than they were when they crossed the border in February 2022. That should not be underestimated. History has shown that countries with vast natural resources, large populations, and strong industrial capacity can fight for a very long time. Russia possesses all of those advantages, but the central question remains the same. Have those sacrifices brought Russia closer to the political goals that justified the invasion? That is where the debate becomes much more complicated. At the beginning of the war, Russia appeared to be pursuing several major objectives: the rapid collapse of Ukraine's government, a leadership in Kyiv that was friendly to Moscow, a permanently neutral Ukraine, and a reversal of Ukraine's growing ties with Europe and the West. More than 4 years later, those goals remain largely unfulfilled. Ukraine is still an independent state. Its government continues to function. Its military is larger, more experienced, and more technologically advanced than before the invasion. Rather than weakening Ukrainian national identity, the war strengthened it. Millions of Ukrainians who once viewed Russia with familiarity now see it as a long-term security threat. The invasion that was intended to bring Ukraine back into Russia's sphere of influence instead pushed much of Ukrainian society further away. The diplomatic consequences tell a similar story. Instead of becoming isolated, Ukraine built deeper relationships with Europe and Western partners. Financial assistance, intelligence sharing, military training, and industrial cooperation created long-term partnerships that are likely to continue even after the war ends. Russia also sought greater security along its western frontier. Yet today, Europe is investing heavily in defense. NATO is larger than it was before the invasion, military cooperation has expanded, and European governments are preparing for a security environment that may remain tense for many years. These developments represent a strategic reality that extends far beyond the battlefield. Of course, none of this means the outcome of the war has already been decided. Wars are unpredictable. Political leadership can change. Economic conditions can shift. International support can increase or decrease. Negotiations could eventually reshape the conflict in ways that neither side currently expects. Russia remains a major military power with significant resources, a powerful defense industry, and one of the world's largest nuclear arsenals. It still has the ability to influence how this war ends. That is why declaring a final winner today would be premature. But history does not judge wars only by asking who occupied more territory. It asks whether those territorial gains achieved the political objectives for which the war was fought. That distinction is crucial. An army can capture land, win battles, and still fall short of its original purpose. History has witnessed this pattern many times. Empires have expanded across maps while watching their long-term strategic goals drift farther away. Military success on the battlefield does not automatically produce political success at the negotiating table. That may become one of the defining lessons of the war in Ukraine. Russia sought to bring Ukraine back under its influence. Instead, Ukraine strengthened its national identity. Russia sought to limit Western influence in the region. Instead, Ukraine became more deeply connected with Europe than ever before. Russia sought a stronger strategic position. Instead, Europe responded with higher defense spending, closer military cooperation, and a renewed focus on collective security. These are outcomes that cannot be measured by front lines alone. In the end, historians may care less about which village changed hands in a particular month, and more about the larger political consequences of the conflict. Did Russia achieve the future it hoped to create? Or did the war gradually move that future further out of reach? Only time can answer that question with certainty. But one lesson is already becoming clear. Wars are not won simply because an army keeps advancing. They are won when military victories create lasting political success. And that is why the story of Ukraine cannot be understood by looking only at maps. The front line tells us where the fighting is taking place. History will tell us whether the sacrifices made on that front line achieved the goals for which the war began. Until that question is answered, the true outcome of this war remains unwritten.